The Pathway of Faith, Introductory. The book of Genesis, or In a Beginning, from the 12th chapter onward, relates the dealings of God with four patriarchs. Abraham, the rock from which the Hebrew nation was hewn, Isaiah 51:1-2. Isaac, the medium through whom Abraham's blessing passed to the posterity, Genesis 21:12. Jacob, the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, Genesis 28:3. And Joseph, the man through whom a remnant is preserved in the earth and saved alive by a great deliverance, Genesis 45:7. These records are rich in lessons of permanent value. With exquisite, artless simplicity, they demonstrate the frailty of our frame, accentuate the gentle forbearance, and illustrate the exhaustless grace of our Heavenly Father. How good of God to give us these glowing records of His changeless love, that we might draw lessons of wisdom and faith. We will first seek to view these records collectively, and then examine each separately at close range. Before proceeding, will the reader kindly charge his heart to pray for the Spirit's illumination, not for himself alone, but for all the fellow saints? The contents of this section of Genesis may be tabulated thus: 12:1-25:11, Abraham, 25:12-18. Interlude. The generations of Ishmael, 25:19-28:9. Isaac, 28:10-35:29. Jacob, 36:1-43. Interlude. The generations of Esau, 37:1-50:26. Joseph. From this simple analysis, it will be seen at a glance that the stories of Abraham and Joseph are cut off from those of Isaac and Jacob by the insertion of parentheses devoted to genealogical records. This arrangement seems to assign to Abraham and Joseph a peculiar place in the divine economy. Careful study justifies this inference. The call of Abraham inaugurates a new departure in God's dealings with mankind. A man is called with a view to the formation of a nation destined to fulfill a special mission in the world. In Joseph, we see a man raised to perform a special mission to this chosen nation. Connected with the call of Abraham is the separation of an elect nation which occupies a peculiar place in relation to God in the nations of the globe. Bound up with the history of Joseph is the miraculous preservation of that nation through a time of calamity. The outstanding feature in this story of the divine government of human lives are the theophanies, or appearances of God. There are 7 recorded appearances to Abraham, 2 to Isaac, 7 to Jacob, and 2 to Joseph. These appearances are unified by a common end, though the means and methods employed in attaining that end are different in each case. The difference is to be accounted for by the differing temperaments exemplified in these men. Variety characterizes God's works in nature. The leaves of a tree are shaped after one pattern, yet no two of them are alike. Each exhibits peculiarities of its own. All planets revolve around the sun, yet each moves in its own orbit. Variety, too, characterizes God's ways and grace. The high and lofty one deals with each child according to the capacity and quality of faith granted to him. He weaves into each thread of life the specific lessons needed. Abraham. The appearances to Abraham are for instruction. Each communication results in a spiritual metamorphosis. The friend of God receives new impetus, changes his course, enters new spheres of activity, rises to a higher plane. Each vision elevates his position, widens his outlook, expands his usefulness. By faith Abraham, being called, obeys, coming out into the place which he was about to obtain, to enjoy as an allotment. Hebrews 11:8. He is a man of responsive nature. When the vision comes, he follows it, even though it entails sacrifice. From the Genesis narrative, it would seem as if Abram's departure was instantaneous after, or simultaneous with, the divine command. Stephen's address to the Sanhedrin, however, shows that, pursuant to a revelation, Abram left Chaldea and set his face toward the land of promise, but for some reason tarried in Haran, and not till after his father's death did he move on to Canaan. What was it that induced Abram thus to linger on the way? The words of Stephen, "And thence after the death of his father, he exiles him into this land in which you are now dwelling," Acts 7:4, seem to attribute Abram's delay at Haran to Terah's influence. Terah's intention on leaving Ur was to go to Canaan, but coming to Charan, he remained there, and Abram, yielding to the paternal wish, tarried with him. Moreover, we learn that, on leaving Charan after Terah's death, Abram took all the goods which they had gathered, and every soul which they had made their own in Charan. There they acquired souls and substance. Was not this also responsible for the delay? These men of enterprise saw a chance of acquiring wealth and decided to take full advantage of the opportunity. These incidental touches afford insight into the character of the man and throw valuable light upon certain phases of his subsequent career. They inform us also that Abram was a man of strong affection and deep feeling, that he was keen and alert, alive to material advantages and the comforts of wealth. Though naturally responsive, when the claims of God made imperative demands and brought him face to face with sacrifice, the interest to be renounced exerted over him a mighty spell and induced vacillation. At such conjunctures, the Lord intervened and drew him out of predicament by a fresh vision. In tracing these appearances of Yahweh, we would behold Abraham going from strength to strength, ascending from one altitude to another. On Mount Moriah is the zenith reached. He stands on the borderland of glory. Earthly limitations touch the fringe of heavenly actualities. There the curtain drops. The saint goes to his rest. A few touches are only added to link his narrative with Isaac's. Isaac, the appearances to Isaac are for reiteration. Isaac is a man retiring, restful, phlegmatic. Deeply sensitive, he grieves for 3 years over his mother's death and goes out in the field to find rest and comfort. A lover of solitude, he well knows the soothing influence of nature over vexed spirits. The moaning of the wind, the murmur of the fountain, the rustling of the grain, possess to him inexpressible charm. A lover of quietude, he avoids din and conflict and devotes himself to peaceful pursuits, the sowing of seed, the digging of wells. He delights to watch the fields of grain undulated by the winds, and loves to soliloquize beside the well when the cover of darkness falls upon the landscape. And withal there is in him a touch of Epicureanism. He loves a savory meal. Love of quiet may dispose to compromise. An aspect of Isaac's makeup is the danger of yielding when action is required. He is apt to retreat when he should take a determined stand. The theophanies are designed to neutralize these natural proclivities of Isaac's disposition and avert the dangers toward which they tend. Both appearances occur at critical junctures. When faith was ready to yield in the face of difficulties, the vision vouchsafed acted as a stimulus and preventative. The Lord reiterated the covenant with Abraham, adding to it fresh promises calculated to strengthen faith and nerve it for conflict. Thus the Lord drew his quiet, passive servant out of retirement by an enlargement of vision. Jacob. The appearances to Jacob are for restriction. Jacob is of a rushing disposition, a man of restless activity and indomitable energy. Isaac's tendency was to lag behind. Jacob's inclination is to go ahead of God. The Lord makes known to him his intention beforehand. The condition of affairs seems unfavorable to the realization of that intention. So Jacob imagines that he must help God and undertakes the task of securing a fulfillment of God's purpose by a clever manipulation of circumstances. He does not rise to the level of the vision, he lowers it to his own level. Instead of complying with the terms of the promise, he seeks, so to speak, to adjust the promise to his condition. He is ever more active, always on the go, but his activity is not in line with God's movements. Hence, he is in constant need of restraint. The aim of the theophanies is to check his independence and direct his energy into proper channels. Jacob, therefore, is repeatedly pointed back to positions of faith previously held, but departed from. Joseph. The appearances to Joseph are for revelation. The two dreams foreshadow the wonderful mission he was destined to perform. Joseph is a perfect character. The story of his life is in some senses the most wonderful in the Hebrew Scriptures. He possesses in a superlative degree the virtues of his predecessors without their faults. He combines the responsiveness of Abraham with the quietness of Isaac and the astuteness and activity of Jacob. His responsiveness is evidenced by unswerving loyalty to the vision. Abraham wavered at times. Thrice he departed from the pathway of the divine will. Joseph neither hesitates nor deviates. He dreams a dream and tells it to his brethren. They do not like the message and hate Joseph for it. He dreams a second dream and forthwith tells it to his brethren. He is unmovable. His responsiveness is unshaken by opposition. He yields neither to pressure of circumstances nor paternal influence. Nothing can change his loyalty to the vision which is set before him. Storms fail to obscure it. He follows its light with steady, unfaltering step, not daunted by adversity nor inflated by prosperity. His quietness is shown by his conduct in the house of Potiphar and in prison. The quietness of Isaac was fearful, restless, and resorted to policy. That of Joseph is fearless, patient, and courts no favor. Without murmur or resentment, he attends to his duties, trustfully awaiting the dawn of a better day. His astuteness is seen both from the advice to Pharaoh and the administration of Egypt during the 7 years' famine. The shrewdness of Jacob substituted a project for God's purpose. That of Joseph operated on the basis of that purpose. Joseph can be passive and responsive. He knows how to be active and how to stand still. He does everything in season. Abraham goes to Egypt and compromises. Joseph is taken to Egypt, yet never compromises. The wealth acquired there by the former is a compensation for dishonor. The glory and honor bestowed upon the latter is the reward of faithfulness and purity. Isaac's policy provoked quarrels with the Philistines. Joseph's tact and discretion enabled him to live in peace with the Egyptians, though it be an abomination for these to eat with the Hebrews. Jacob, and especially his sons, easily absorbed the customs of those surrounding them. Joseph never did so, though his whole career, in both adversity and prosperity, offered peculiar temptations in this respect. Pure, brave, gracious, uncompromising, Joseph walks through life unscathed by sin, undismayed by opposition, undefiled by seduction. How beautiful the tribute to his character uttered by dying Jacob. Offshoot of a fruitful plant is Joseph, the offshoot of a fruitful plant by a spring, whose sprigs have climbed up on the straight wall. The archers had been bitterly enraged against him. They had contended with him and begrudged him. But his bow remained in perennial steadiness, and the arms of his hands were supple because of the hands of the sturdy one of Jacob. Because there is the shepherd of the Israel stone. Because of your father's El, may he help you. And the one who suffices, may he bless you, with blessings of the heavens above, with blessings of the abyss reclining beneath, with blessings of breasts and womb. The blessings of your father have gained the mastery over the blessings on my progenitors, unto the yearning of the Ionian hills. May they come to be onto the head of Joseph and onto the crown of the one singled out from his brothers. General 49, 22-26. This is a charming story. Faith is burning, love is radiant, expectation is beaming. Their blended light illumines the darkness about him. Would God that the same could be said of all God's people today? But alas, how rare have these spiritual graces become. Faith in our great Master is at its ebb. Love for all the saints is rare indeed. Hope is dim. But how great is our thankfulness for the few who offer a mite upon God's glorious altar. These four characters seem to form a cycle. The testimony declines after Abraham, but rises in Joseph to its meridian height. In the divine methods, too, there seems to be a perfect unfolding. Responsive Abraham is instructed, initiated in the secrets of the Lord. The dormant faith of passive Isaac is stirred to activity. The fleshly energy of Jacob is checked and subdued. The uprightness of Joseph yields its finer graces under bruising and pressure, and is finally rewarded and crowned. Our way is now prepared for a more detailed study of these records. Abraham's pathway. The biographies of the Bible are brief and ungarnished. The narrator describes the career of the elect with superhuman simplicity, calmness, and fidelity. His purpose is to instruct and edify. Hence the account is given in the smallest possible compass. It is devoid of comment, moralizing, or exhortation. There is no attempt at embellishment, no indication anywhere of the human propensity to elate the good and extenuate the bad. He is not a man to magnify the attractive and minimize the somber in men's lives. The narrative of Abraham consists of 7 theophanies and 3 deflections from the pathway of the divine will, which may be shown thus: I, 12:1-3. First theophany, 12:4-6. Results, Sanan, 12:7. Second theophany, 12:7-9. Results, 12:10-13. 13. First deflection, Egypt. Third, 13:14-17. Third theophany, 13:18 to 14. 24th results, April 15th to 1st 5. Fourth theophany, April 15th to 6:21. Results 16 to 16. Second deflection, Hagar, 5, 17 to 21. Fifth theophany, 17, 22 to 27. Results June, 18 to 33. Sixth theophany, 19 to 38. Results 21 to 18. Third deflection, Gerar, 7th, 22, 1, 2. Seventh theophany, 22, 3:25:11. Results. The crowning victories of a great career are always more inspiring when they can be viewed in the light of the campaigns of earlier days. The exploits of the cloud of witnesses, Hebrew 12:1, are more enhancing because the winners of the trophies once lay prostrate in the ashes of defeat. Their histories are written for our learning, that inspired by their faith and warned by their failure, we may imitate the former and shun the latter. The first appearance, the first communication to Abram, was in the nature of a call to separation. Yahweh said to Abram, "Go from me to, and I shall." When the Lord spoke thus, he had in mind a great purpose comprising a group of 7 blessings, Genesis 12:2-3. The accomplishment of that purpose, however, was conditioned on Abram's implicit, unquestioning compliance with the command, "Go from." What a disturbing charge. The divine voice came, "Go from," and in a moment Abram's arrangements are upset. Ties that had become entwined around the heart are snapped. The aspirations of the heart are crushed, and he is left stranded in darkness. Until that initial word was obeyed, God had nothing further to say. Abram submitted to that revolutionary order. They went forth to go to the land of Canaan, and they entered to the land of Canaan. Genesis 12:5. Destination was reached in safety because they kept step with God's movement. The second appearance, reaching the land of God's appointment, Abram found himself face to face with the Canaanite. The land is really his by divine assignment. Actually, the Canaanite holds it by right of conquest. Abram received it by promise, and only faith in that promise will support him in the presence of the Canaanite. Therefore, upon his arrival, Yahweh appears to reiterate the promise, "To your seed am I giving this land." Genesis 12:7. In consequence of the appearance, Abram built an altar, pitched a tent, and called upon the name of Yahweh. The altar marked his covenant relationship to God. The tent expressed his surrender to the claims of that relationship, while the calling on Yahweh betokened reliance on divine protection against opponents. The position of Abram's tent exquisitely expresses the transforming power of faith. He dwells on a mountain, halfway between Ai and Bethel. On the east, the place of sunrise is Ai. On the west, the place of sunset, lies Bethel. Abram is in a strait between a rubbish heap and the house of God. He retires from the former and reaches after the latter, viewing both from an elevation. Ai was a mighty city. In the days of Joshua, Israel underrated its strength and experienced defeat. But Abram waited for the city having foundations, whose artificer and architect is God. Hebrews 11:10. He had seen and greeted it from afar. Its holy light spelled the doom of Hamitic kingdoms. Canaan flourishes before eyes, but beyond present prosperity and military prowess looms Canaan wasted. The fiery strokes of vengeance have not yet engulfed the land. The day of retribution is still far off, but the light of truth made the overthrow of that civilization a present reality, which became a potent factor in Abram's life, a factor that determined his attitude and controlled his relations with the inhabitants of the land. The flame of truth consumed base desires for things below and kindled a holy passion for things above. The city of God is Abram's source of inspiration, object of aspiration, and spring of action. At this juncture occurs the first deflection. Canaan is struck by famine. This new difficulty clouds Abram's vision and unnerves his faith. He journeys to Egypt, the wheat market of the ancient world. The character and history of ancient Egypt are of absorbing interest. The people and the land were in many respects unique. The fecundity of the soil, unlike other countries, was not contingent on seasonal showers. There was no rain in Egypt. The Nile inundated the country twice a year. When the waters receded, they left an alluvial deposit which fertilized the soil and caused it to bring forth. The Egyptians, therefore, regarded the Nile as the source of their phenomenal prosperity, and felt themselves quite independent of the rain which God sends on the just and the unjust. Their boast was, "Mine is my waterway," Ezekiel 29:3. Again, Egypt is bounded by the Nile and the desert. The river brought tides of prosperity. The dry desert winds blew the scorching sands that blasted the harvest, so that Egypt was the scene of interrupted contest between prosperity and adversity, between life and death. Furthermore, the ruthless hand of death has left a deep mark upon Egyptian history. Its cold breath chills us as we delve into its lore. The monuments which have come down to us are the mummies, the embalmed bodies of rulers, and the pyramids which are royal sepulchres. The worship of the dead was a prominent feature in the religion of ancient Egypt. Its great work of literature is the Book of the Dead. How admirably is the spirit of the world portrayed in Egypt. That great land of art and trade and magic lived and moved and had its being. Apart from God, it worshipped nature but ignored the God of nature. Its titanic energy was devoted to making their land beautiful and attractive, a place where God would not be missed. Decay and death, the faithful reminders of man's sin and God's sovereignty, ravaged Egypt. Their mossy fingers turned its magnificence to ashes, and yet the Egyptians went on and would not be warned nor turn from the error of their way. Some places, like some characters, appear to best advantage at a distance. Self-pleasing invests them with a false halo which enhances for a time their superficial attractions and conceals their defects, but which disappears after the first desire has been gratified. Looked at from a distance, Egypt possessed, like these characters, a beauty which faded away on closer acquaintance. Seeking escape from death, Abram plunged into the slough of spiritual death. The atmosphere of Egypt choked faith. Expediency became Abram's rule of life. He wrought deceit upon Pharaoh with the consent and connivance of his wife to be treated well. Genesis 12:11-16. Fear replaces hope. Bethel fades from the horizon. The godlessness of the Egyptians haunts his spirit. How has the gold become dim? How is the most pure gold changed? Prayer, tent, altar, all vanish, and Abram becomes a servile courtier at the Egyptian palace. Doubtless Abram embarked on this course to avoid trouble, but his cunning failed utterly. It proved unwholesome to him and mischievous to the Egyptians, for it brought the very evil it was intended to avert. Yahweh touched Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Genesis 12:17. So much for compromises. They sap the life of those who condescend to them and harm those for whose supposed benefit they are made. The visit to Egypt was far-reaching in its effects. Pharaoh gave Abram sheep, oxen, donkeys, and camels, as well as servants, in compensation for subserviency. This wealth later on proved a source of vexation. The cattle estranged him from Lot, and one Egyptian maid became subsequently the cause of much distress. When Pharaoh learned how Abram had misled him concerning Sarai, he sent him back to Canaan along with his wife and nephew Lot, enriched with cattle and servants. So Abram went his way by stages from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the start, between Bethel and Ai. Genesis 13:3. The consequences of Abram's first deviation soon manifested themselves. Quarrels between the herdsmen of Abram and Lot resulted in the separation of the latter from his uncle. With great magnanimity, Abram gave Lot the privilege of choice. Genesis 13:7-9. We do not question his generosity displayed on the occasion. But was it not inspired by Abram's recognition that his own conduct was the prime cause of the division which had taken place? The third appearance, the Lord appeared unto Abram again, after Lot parted company with him, and said, Now lift up your eyes and see from the place where you are, northward into the Negev, and eastward into the sea. For all the land that you are seeing, I shall give it to you and to your seed unto the eon. Rise, walk about in the land throughout its length and its width, for I am giving it to you and to your seed unto the eon. Genesis 13:14-17. Now lift up your eyes and see. Rise, walk about. This announcement sets forth the method of spiritual progress. A vision is given that the life may be transformed. Truth is the foundation and source of practice. while true practice is the outcome of truth received and obeyed. So Abram moved his tent and came to dwell among the oaks of Mamre at Hebron. Then he built an altar there to Yahweh. Genesis 13:18. Here he enters upon a new sphere of service. We have seen a pilgrim with a tent and an altar. Now we shall see a soldier fighting the king's battles. This new departure in life is the direct fruit of the sojourn at Hebron. Darting from the presence of Yahweh, Abram defeats the army of the greatest conqueror of his age, liberates the prisoners of war, recovers all the property, and returns laden with spoils. But Abram has made progress along other lines as well. Another fruit of communion appears, the grace of giving, and that at a time when we should least expect it, when life and prosperity were risked in war with the Confederate kings of the invading army. Contact with the world's sin and sorrow is the best stimulant to liberality. Herein lies the secret of giving. A contrast of the principle here disclosed with much that is in vogue today in the matter of our finances is by no means to our advantage. Entertainments may replenish the coffers of a church, but they introduce many worldly ways which asphyxiate life. The best remedy for financial depression is a contemplation of Golgotha. When the heart abides beneath its sacred shadow, the love which prompted the great sacrifice will kindle the spirit of renunciation, and the justice that consumed it will purge the spirit of worldliness. The fourth appearance. Every spiritual level has its own perils. Evil exists only as opposition to good. Behind every force for good lurks a force for evil. Every new conquest in realms spiritual arouses new forces of opposition. Two dangers menace Abram in the capacity of soldier: fear of death and love of gain. So Yahweh fortifies his servant against these perils of the new way by further grants of grace. Do not fear, Abram. I am your shield, your exceedingly increased reward. Genesis 15:1. The Lord also brought him out of the tent, bade him look on the starry heavens, and said, Thus shall become your seed. Genesis 15:5. This was to be his reward, and he got an anterior glimpse of it. The light afflictions, which are for a moment, are counterbalanced by a vision of the more abundant weight of glory which they work. Abram believed in Yahweh, and he reckoned it to him for righteousness. Genesis 15:6. The apprehension of his relationship deepens. Faith lays firmer hold on the unseen, the covenant concerning the land is confirmed, and the former declaration, To your seed I shall give this land, 12:7, is replaced by another. To your seed I give this land, 15:18. The second deflection, the promise of a seed, called for a fresh exercise of faith on Abram's part. It was contrary to nature, and therefore startling in the extreme. Sarai was barren. Both were advanced in age. Extant conditions apparently precluded a performance of the promise. The word of God made the pair feel their impotence. Conscious of inability, Abram and Sarai decided on a plan that seemed to make possible the advent of an heir. Sarai took Hagar, the Egyptian, her bondmaid, and gave her to her husband to be his wife. Genesis 16:1-2. The child born of that union was as a wild ass among men. His hand was against every man, and every man's hand was against him. He was debarred from the inheritance, and Abram was eventually ordered to cast him out. Genesis 16:12, 21:9-14. The Hagar scheme originated in self-occupation and distrust of God's word. It is hard for the flesh to believe God. Adam in Eden was tested by the word of God. God had spoken, and the question was, will man believe God? This was the one simple test. It was not what tradition degrades to the eating of an apple. The crucial test in Eden was, has God said? Our first parents failed to believe God's word, and their descendants follow their steps. Abram here meets the same test with the same sad results. Amid the boisterous activity of this age, we, like Martha, stand in danger of devoting too much attention to side issues and neglect the one thing needed, the Word. Some time ago, while holding meetings in a Canadian town, a minister came to us at the close of a service to express his appreciation of our address. He said, "You have given us solid meat, but you know we preachers must use spices." We replied, "My brother, herein is the trouble. We have devoted altogether too much time to the preparation of spices and have neglected the meat. May God give us such a desire for the meat of his truth as will dispense with spices. It is a matter of God's appointment that sinners should be saved and saints edified and nourished by the teaching of God's word. Let us then affectionately devote ourselves to this glorious task. We are naturally self-reliant, apt to trust the arm of flesh rather than his Holy Spirit, and liable to mistake perfunctory routine for wholehearted service. The church of today suffers from the effect of over-organization, but our multi-nominal church organization has afforded little relief. Ecclesiastical organizations are losing ground, while spiritual apathy gains on us by leaps and bounds. The fifth appearance, between this appearance and the antecedent, lies an interim of 15 years. When Abram was 99 years old, Yahweh appeared to Abram and said to him, I am El who suffices. Walk before me and become a man of integrity. Genesis 17:1. With much gentleness and delicacy, the Lord lays his finger on the sore spot. I am El who suffices, the God that is enough, the one able to perform his promise, the one whose might is irresistible. Here is a new self-revelation of God. After a long, monotonous silence, Yahweh appears to display his power before his troubled servant. Abram sees God in a new light, and with the new conception of God, there comes a new outlook upon life, a new attitude toward men and circumstances. God makes himself known by a new name, and Abram too receives a new name. Abraham, father of many nations, suggestive of fruitfulness resulting from union with God and springing from a new comprehension of his power. God's might sweeps the obstacles which impede its advance. Its power in life means the crucifixion of the flesh, for we who are living, says the apostle, are ever being given up to death because of Jesus, that the life also of Jesus may be manifested in our mortal flesh, says 2 Corinthians 4:11. The flesh which limited God's power and leaned on its own contrivances is crippled. Abraham is ordered to circumcise himself. His flesh bears the seal and mark of Yahweh's victory. The sixth appearance, shortly afterward, the Lord appeared unto Abraham under the oaks of Mamre and renewed the promise of a seed, Genesis 18:1-10. Before departing, the Lord unbosomed himself with regard to Sodom's awful doom. In consequence of this condescension, Abraham's life assumes a different phase. We have seen him as witness and soldier. Now he appears before us as intercessor, pleading before the judge of all the earth on behalf of the guilty cities of the plain. Genesis 18:16-33. Abraham knew of Lot's sojourn in Sodom. He knew too that Lot's influence for God there could be infinitesimal at the most. So he endeavors to supply by prayer the deficiency of a testimony marred by worldliness and inconsistency. The third deflection, after the doom of Sodom, Abraham went to Gerar, Genesis 21, and essayed once more the tactics which had proved so disastrous in Egypt, and the ministry of intercession temporarily ceased. The man who not long ago interceded for Sodom now imperiled the whole land of the Philistines. He swerved from the service of prayer and was restored on condition that he pray for Abimelech, who had been endangered by his disloyalty. Genesis 20:17-18. Before advancing, let us note how variously the theophanies following the return from Egypt affected Abraham. The third, Genesis 13:14-17, dealt with the land and influenced his surroundings. The fourth, Genesis 15:1-5, that of the seed determined his companionship. The fifth, Genesis 17-21, the self-revelation of God as El who suffices, molded his character. Lastly, the sixth, Genesis 18-33, unraveling God's secret purpose, directed his service. The junctures at which occur the three deflections represent the vulnerable points in the life of faith. The first blow is directed against a separated walk, the second against trust in the word, the third against prayer. The adversary always concentrates his assaults on these three citadels of sainthood. Deflection from God's path exposes the believers to Satan's attacks, and he is ever on the alert to take advantage of opportunities and utilize them to the best of his ability. Yet Satan is but an agent in carrying out God's disciplinary plans. And when we fall into his hands and experience the influence of his mighty spells, it is only for the purpose of diverting us from hidden shoals and leads us to a closer walk with God. Satan's malignity and the magnificent results which the wisdom of God accomplishes through its medium remind one of the painter, who, actuated by jealousy, flung a sponge at the canvas of his rival, intending to obliterate the scene, but producing by the merest accident the very effect which the artist's utmost efforts had failed to secure. God's purposes are at times born in obscurity, but the very gloom from which they emerge heightens their after effect. The seventh appearance, when the seed was first promised, Abraham questioned God's ability to perform his word. Later, the Lord appeared to him as the El who suffices, and shortly afterward, the child of promise was born. In the process of time, God tried Abraham again and said, "Take now your son, your only one, whom you love, Isaac, and go by yourself to the Moriah area and offer him up there as an ascent offering on one of the mountains which I shall indicate to you." Genesis 22:2. Faith is now tested on the spot of antecedent defeat. Only the ordeal is now severer, because the light possessed is greater. Abraham has seen God's victory over the flesh. He is about to see his triumph over Satan's power. Death. Past failure has strengthened Abraham's hold on things unseen and demonstrated the unthinkable reaches of divine power. So when the order comes to offer Isaac, he carries it out unhesitatingly. He has not the remotest idea how God can deliver Isaac. He knows that God is all-sufficient and therefore equal to the emergency of the occasion. When the appointed place was reached, Abraham said to his young men, "You sit here with the donkey while I and the youth shall go thus far. There we shall worship, and we shall return to you." Genesis 22:5. His faith shows itself equal to the crisis. But a severer test was ahead. As the two advanced toward the mountain, Isaac said to his father, "Behold the fire and the wood, yet where is the flockling for the ascent offering?" Verse 7. Could he say to the child of his love, "You are the ascent offering, my son"? His answer was, "Elohim shall provide for himself the flockling for the ascent offering, my son." Verse 8. How gloriously his faith soars above impediments. The summit of the mount is reached, the altar is built, the wood laid in order. Isaac is bound and laid on the altar upon the wood. Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. At this juncture, the voice of the messenger of Yahweh is heard from the heavens. "Do not stretch out your hand on the youth, and do not do anything to him, for now I know that you fear Elohim, since you have not kept back your son, your only one, from me." Genesis 22:12. Lifting up his eyes, Abraham beheld a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for an ascent offering instead of his son. Then Abraham called the name of the place Yahweh Yireh, returned to his young men, and rose up and went to Beersheba. Yahweh Yireh means Yahweh shall see. But the word Yireh admits of another rendering, namely provide, as rendered in verse 8. By combining the thoughts suggested by the two readings, we grasp the stupendous truth that the God of vision is the God of provision. The foresight and omnipotence of God are two wings of an eagle that soar into the empyrean, bearing Abraham upon their pinions. The design of the Lord has been attained. His servant has entered into fellowship with himself concerning the sufferings of the Holy One. His heart vibrates, in a small measure of course, with the same feeling which agitated the heart of God when he gave his son to die for us. Human experience can go no further this side of the grave. The curtain drops upon the scene, and the saint goes to his rest in hope of a better resurrection. Now, my readers, will you give up conformity to the world? If so, you may, every one of you, be transformed at this moment. Respond to his love. You may make your abiding place in Christ and have all the power and glory which comes to those who possess him. You may, like Abraham, advance from the miserable condition of a poor up and down, in and out, wretched man, onto the glorious vantage ground of a transformed man, a transformed woman, a triumphant believer on the pathway of faith. Isaac's pathway. The life of Isaac is dealt with in Genesis 25:19 to 28:9. Our primary concern is to take in the entire history at one view, in order to see the relation of part to part and understand their setting in the whole narrative. The story is made up of two domestic pictures at different stages of life, separated from one another by an account of the personal experiences of Isaac. First, we learn the circumstances attending the birth of Isaac's two sons, the tendencies displayed by the children in adolescence, and the divine intention respecting them. Next comes the recital of the two theophanies to Isaac. And lastly, the blessing of Jacob and Esau, followed by certain events in their early manhood. Perhaps the simplest form in which to exhibit this arrangement of contents is the following: 25:19 to 26. Birth of Esau and Jacob, 25:27 to 34. Esau and Jacob, childhood, 26:1 to 33. Isaac, 26:34 to 27:46. Blessing of Jacob and Esau, 28:1 to 9. Jacob and Esau, manhood. We glean from this analysis that the dealings of God directly with Isaac are confined to a single chapter, 26. To trace the story of the divine dealings with a human soul, from the day of its spiritual awakening, down through the labyrinthine paths of earthly pilgrimage, is a recital of absorbing fascination. It holds us with a spell more powerful than that of any other narrative. Step by step, through the vicissitudes of life, we trace the gradual progress of the Spirit in the path of truth, the vision of God becoming clearer and more splendid as the years roll on. Two movements are discernible in the life of Isaac. The first is a movement of declension. Failure pervades it all. The testimony is rejected, the witness repudiated. Men are repulsed from the light. The torch of truth burns dimly because Isaac lives in the fear of men. The second movement is one of ascension. The light of truth shines unclouded because Isaac has reposed his trust in God, walks in communion with him, and takes a decided, definite attitude toward the inhabitants of Canaan. The testimony is received, the witness respected, men respond. It is written in the Proverbs 29:25, "A man's over-anxiety becomes a trap for him, yet he who trusts in Yahweh shall be made impregnable." The two periods of Isaac's life furnish a living demonstration, an inspired commentary, I might say, of the practical working of the two antithetic maxims of this saying of the wise king. The events of Isaac's career range themselves around the two theophanies. Thus, first movement declension, 26.1. The famine, 26.2 to 5. The first theophany, 26.6 to 22. Results, second movement ascension, 26:23. Journey to Beersheba, 26:24. The second theophany, 26:25 to 33. Results, by reading Genesis 26:1 on from chapter 25:11, we shall notice the connection between certain events. And it came to pass after the death of Abraham that Elohim blessed Isaac his son. Isaac was dwelling by the well Lahai Roi, and there came to be a famine in the land, aside from the former famine that occurred in the days of Abraham. The relation of the famine to the blessing is thus brought to our notice. The adversary is ever ready to contest the blessings which the Lord bestows and to dispute every inch of the road to spiritual progress. As in the case of Abraham, the bestowal of initial blessing on Isaac is met by a counter-move of the enemy seeking to intimidate the witness. The tactics of the evil one present nothing but a weary repetition, monotonous in the last degree. He first attacks those strongholds, the surrender of which involves the loss of God consciousness. Then he magnifies and enthrones the material and substitutes sensual pursuits for spiritual aspirations. And at last he leads his dupes to thorough concentration upon self. The first appearance, the advent of the famine, shook the confidence of Isaac. Perturbed by gloomy forebodings, he altered his plans and went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, to Gerar. This step, so it appears from the divine communication, was taken with the evident intention of repairing to Egypt, and the prime object of the theophany was to foil this project. "You must not go down to Egypt. Tabernacle in the land of which I apprise you. Sojourn in this land, and I shall be with you and bless you." Genesis 26:2. He who guides his people by the skillfulness of his hands gives his children meat in due season and administers each lesson at the proper moment. The message to Isaac is admirably suited to his environments. The famine has cast a shadow across his path and marred the unalloyed blessing hitherto enjoyed. The journey to Philistia has upset the accustomed round of daily routine and enshrouded the future in disquieting precariousness. With a direction and a pair of promises, the Lord meets the situation at every point. Tabernacle in this land. This guiding word creates a citadel of certainty amidst uncertainty. I shall be with you and bless you. These two promises shield him from the threatening clouds that have appeared on the horizon. The first promise is intended to fortify Isaac in the presence of the Philistines, while the second is calculated to allay the apprehensions aroused by the famine. To the believer, the world is a school and life a discipline. The curriculum in the school of life comprises two lessons: the insufficiency of self and the all-sufficiency of God. The impartation of this twofold lesson constituted the grand object of the wilderness training of the Hebrews. The Israelites suffered from two evils. They overestimated their own strength and underestimated God's power. All that Yahweh speaks we shall do, Exodus 19:8, was their estimate of self, and that in view of the fact that the journey from the Red Sea to Sinai, where these words were spoken, was a long series of murmurings and rebellions against Yahweh's ways. Is El able to arrange a table in the wilderness? Psalm 78, verse 19, was their estimate of God. Subsequent history fully demonstrated what they could do in departing from the living God, and what depths of grace the Lord could show in pardoning their transgression. The self-discovery which accompanies moral failure contains the key to new and larger experiences. Through sorrow, he leads us to a new sphere and bids us look out upon life from a new point. Circumstances are but unexpected examinations which reveal to us the great attained in the school of faith and accentuate the possibilities that lie beyond the crisis. If we will only renounce confidence in the flesh and trust God's love alone. Isaac, confounded by the famine, weakened in faith and leaned on his ability to handle the situation diplomatically. When the presence of God is not real to faith, human conduct is easily influenced by circumstances and dominated by the opinions of men. The peace-giving promise, "I shall be with you," did not overshadow Isaac. Fear took possession of his heart, and his one aim was to win the approval of the men of the place. He feared to say of Rebekah, "She is my wife," lest the men of the place kill him. Genesis 26:7. "Otherwise I might die on her account," 26:9, is now the mainspring of all his actions. In process of time, the duplicity of Isaac was discovered. His own conduct betrayed the falsehood of his former affirmation and made it plain to Abimelech that Rebekah was not his sister, but his wife. Startled by a sudden discovery of the futility of his method, Isaac confessed to misconduct, admitting at the same time the cause which prompted it. The Italians have a fine proverb, "Lies are short-legged." The gist of it is that no matter how much ahead of truth falsehood may get at the start, truth is sure to overtake it. If Isaac had forgotten this lesson, he had such a forceful, practical demonstration of its truth that he was not likely to forget it again. Fear is contagious. On learning that Isaac was afraid of the Philistines, Abimelech becomes in turn afraid of him. He remembered his experience with Abraham. Although he had taken Sarah unto him in consequence of deliberate misrepresentation of facts on the part of Abraham, God said to him in the visions of the night, "You are to die. If you are not restoring her, know that you shall die, yea die, you and all who are yours." Genesis 23:7. His kingdom had been brought face to face with destruction, and now Abraham's son, following the father's tactics, lays the country open to the same peril. Abimelech grasps the gravity of the situation and, to avert a possible catastrophe, issues a decree. "Whoever touches this man or his wife shall be put to death, yea, death." Genesis 26:11. Isaac at last has nothing to fear. Thanks to the successful issue of his diplomacy, he enjoys rest. The king's decree ensures him immunity from the men of the place. By a stroke of policy, Isaac has brought to his support the secular arm and, protected from interference, devotes himself to agriculture, farms a district, sows seed, and finds 100-fold because the Lord blesses him. And the man waxed great, and he grew more and more until he became very great, and had possession of flocks, and possession of herds, and a great household. The Lord remained true to his promise of blessing, notwithstanding the unfaithfulness of his servant. He remains faithful, he cannot disown himself. The peace thus secured was not durable, however. In the course of life, we may outgrow certain outward circumstances and inward conditions, which have been instrumental in our temptation, and pass from moral strait and stress to ease. But there is no hopefulness in this, unless the rest achieved is the palm of victory over sin. Otherwise, the quietude we enjoy is but a moral lethargy, presaging the approach of spiritual insensibility. How often the attainment of a long-cherished end leads to spiritual stagnation. But the Lord has a wonderful way of startling his servants from the even tenor of their way. Deep and wonderful is the principle underlying God's disciplinary methods. He punishes his people with the very things for the sake of which they sell his glory. King Asa is a pattern case. At the commencement of his reign, Zerah, the Nubian, Ethiopian, came against him with an army of 1,000,000 and 300 chariots. Asa betook himself to prayer and said, O Yahweh, there is no one beside you to help the one without vigor against the multitude. Help us, O Yahweh, our Elohim, for we lean on you, and in your name we have come against this throng. The Lord answered the king's prayer. The Nubians were smitten. The land of Judah enjoyed rest for over 30 years, and many Israelites from the northern kingdom fell to him in abundance, when they saw that the Lord his God was with him. 2 Chronicles 14, 9-15-9. Toward the close of Asa's reign, the king of Israel went up against Judah and built Ramah to prevent any further exodus of his subjects. But Asa, instead of resorting to fasting and prayer, as at the first, robbed the treasury of the temple and sent a present to the king of Syria with a message. Come, annul your covenant with Baasha king of Israel, so that he may go away from me. 2 Chronicles 16:3. The king of Syria hearkened to Asa and invaded Samaria. The Syrians smote several Israelitish cities, forcing Baasha to withdraw from Judean territory and abandon the building of fortifications. Asa wanted to avoid war. When Baasha retired, Asa thought to have accomplished his object and possibly congratulated himself upon so felicitous an issue of the negotiations. But truly, God's thoughts are not our thoughts. When Asa returned to Jerusalem, the prophet met him with the following message. As for the Cushites and the Libyans, were they not a vast army with chariots and horsemen in very great abundance? Yet because you leaned on Yahweh, he gave them into your hand. For as regards Yahweh, his eyes go to and fro through all the earth to reinforce the heart of those who are at peace with him. You were exceedingly unwise in this matter, so henceforth there will be wars against you. 2 Chronicles 16:8-9. So henceforth there will be wars against you, the very thing Asa endeavored to avert. He sold the interests of God to obviate war, and God punished him with war. The operation of the same principle is also discernible in the case before us. Isaac employed cunning to escape strife, and God punished him with strife. May we lay to heart this solemn principle. We have already noted the phenomenal wealth acquired by Isaac, subsequent to the issuance of a decree by Abimelech. The Philistines, however, could not view with equanimity the greatness of an alien whose prosperity they attributed to the favor shown him by their king. Their animosity is roused to a high pitch and cries for vengeance. The situation has become intensely acute. Abimelech is alarmed. The ill feeling of his subjects toward Isaac increases the chance of guiltiness being brought upon his kingdom. The Philistines have already expressed their resentment in the spiteful act of filling Isaac's wells with sand. Quarrels arose between the servants of Isaac and the herdsmen of Gerar. A casual word might intensify the friction and precipitate a crisis at any moment. The occasion called for decisive action to prevent disaster. Accordingly, Abimelech says to Isaac, Go away from our people, for you are much more staunch than we. Genesis 26:16. It is Isaac's wealth acquired under the king's protectorate that has become a menace to the land. Yet Isaac was slow to retire and lingered in the valley of Gerar. There he dug 2 wells which provided strife between the servants of Isaac and the local herdsmen. Thereupon he removed from thence and dug another well for which they strove not. Isaac interpreted the absence of strife as a divine monition, saying, Now the Lord hath made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land. And on the strength of this intimation moved onward toward Beersheba. This move was epical and inaugurated the dawn of a new era. The second appearance, the journey to Beersheba, was a step in the right direction. By what is termed the force of circumstances, Isaac is thrown back upon the divine path. On reaching Beersheba, the Lord appeared unto Isaac the same night, and he said, I am the Elohim of Abraham your father. You must not fear, for I am with you, and I will bless you, and I will increase your seed for the sake of Abraham your father. Genesis 26:24. You must not fear, for I am with you. This bears the cause of failure and points out the remedy. With what gentle, unwearied patience the Lord repeats the lessons which we have failed to learn. In consequence of the theophany, Isaac built an altar, called upon the name of Yahweh, and pitched a tent, openly avowing his allegiance to God and dependence on him for protection. At this place, Isaac's servants dug a well. Here at this juncture, Abimelech went to Isaac from Gerar with Ahuzath his friend and Phicol the captain of his host. It is significant that Abimelech's visit occurs as a parenthesis, interrupting the narrative of the well. This fact teaches that the digging of this well demonstrated something to Abimelech, and the latter's visit proved something to Isaac. The Philistines kept close watch over Isaac after his withdrawal from their land. They anxiously awaited developments, wondering what would become of the man whose welfare they thought depended on their favor. With eager eye they followed his movements, and behold, his prosperity increases. The blessing doubles. He waxes very great, and none can stand before him. Abimelech's visit, Abimelech is now convinced, and his coming with a friend and the captain of his host proves that he voiced the consensus of opinion, that Isaac's prosperity depended not on his patronage, but on the God whose name Isaac invoked, and the fear of God fell on the Philistines. On Isaac's inquiry, "For what reason do you come to me?" Abimelech replied, "We see, yea, see that Yahweh has come to be with you. You are now the blessed of Yahweh." Genesis 26:28, 29. This was equally true before, no less so than now. But Isaac's conduct had veiled the movements of God's arm and befogged his operations. But since Isaac has recanted and eschewed his former manner of procedure and publicly called upon Yahweh, the truth blazes in full radiance on the opponents. The working of God is now seen and acknowledged by all. His enemies confess the power of God and seek reconciliation with his servant. Isaac too discerns in Abimelech's visit and stupendous affirmation a manifest token of Yahweh's working, a token of his fulfilling the promise confirmed to Abraham with an oath on Mount Moriah. Your seed shall tenant the gateway of its enemies. Hence the naming of the well Beersheba, well of the oath. Jacob's pathway. The eventful career of Jacob is contained within the comparatively small compass of Genesis 28:1 through 35:28. The closing chapter of his life, 46:1 through 7, though woven into the history of Joseph, is an integral part of the preceding narrative, the vision therein chronicled having no bearing on either Joseph or his brethren. The life of Jacob is perplexing to many. Looked at in askance at the commencement of the life of faith, it heightens in meaning and beauty, acquiring increasing force and value as experience expands and life's sun nears the horizon. Although, by reason of low standards in morals and practice, his biography may at first seem less entrancing than the others, yet it is second to none as concerns the splendid triumphs achieved through grace. I have just remarked that the indomitable energy of the flesh displayed in Jacob seems to detract from the attractiveness of the story. Yet this very exhibition of weakness which was finally conquered, lends the story an endearing charm. Men like Joseph are rare visitors among mortals. As a comet, set like a gem in nocturnal blue, silvers her way in the sky, drawing universal attention and admiration, and then vanishes as suddenly as it came, not to reappear again for hundreds and even thousands of years, men of Joseph's caliber are few and far apart in the history of the race, coming by the will of God, accomplishing his special errands. Extraordinary characters like Abraham, whose faith at times soars in dazzling empyrean heights, at times wades in miry clay, appear more frequently in the ranks of the redeemed, yet they also are rare. Even temperaments like Isaac, moving around the commonplaces, neither scaling heights nor descending depths, marred by weaknesses of self-indulgence, with all breathing a fragrance of quietude and gentleness, with an air of saintliness hanging about them as golden chains about the neck, are more common, but still a desideratum whose absence is keenly felt. But one of Jacob's stamp, following his own inclinations, preferring paltry schemes of his to the flaming splendor of God's glory, prostituting grand and glorious opportunities, involving himself in sorrows and tribulations, and then suddenly mounting up as an eagle to soar consciously and steadily toward the distant orb of perfect light. and from that eminence glance backward upon a succession of wasted years, and feel amid the vibrations of celestial chords the pang of keen remorse. The remorse of what could have been is akin to the vast mass of believers. Crystallized in his experience are the sorrows and struggles and weaknesses which beset the path of the majority of the saints. Every word of such a story is instinct with life. Every sentence is a harbinger of hope, and our hearts throb a tribute of loving gratitude to the God of love, who has given us such a tale of matchless grace, glorious, exhaustless love. The life of Jacob naturally divides itself into two periods. The first, embracing 4 theophanies, extends from the flight to Haran to the sojourn at Succoth, where he built himself a house. The second, embracing 3 theophanies, extends from the sojourn at Shechem to the close of his career in Egypt. We may describe the first period of his life as the period of the restless activity of faith. Each theophany is followed by an act of Jacob showing his independence of Yahweh's communication. The second period we characterize as that of the restful activity of faith. Jacob has learned by painful experience to act in conjunction with God. There is no independent act, but immediate compliance with the words of the vision. The subjoined analysis may aid the student as a basis of further study. I 28:1-11. The flight to Haran, 28:12-15. The vision, Bethel, 28:16-22. The vow, 29:1-30:43. At Padan, Syria, 2. 31:1.2. The report, 31.3. The vision, 31.4-16. The consultation, 31:17-54. Flight from Laban, 3rd 31:55-32:1. Departure from Mizpah, 32:2. The vision, Mahanaim, 32:3-20. The preparation, 32:21. At Jabbok, 4:32-22, 23. The crossing of Jabbok, 32:24-29. The vision, Peniel, 32:33-16. Meeting with Esau, 33:17. Journey to Succoth, v. 33:18-34:31. At Shechem, 35:1. The vision, 35:2-7. Journey to Bethel, 6:35.8. Deborah's death, 35.9-13. The vision, 35.14-23. Journey to Ephrath, 7th 46:1. Journey to Beersheba, 46:2-4. The vision, 46.5-7. Journey to Egypt, the first appearance. The first appearance of God to Jacob occurred at Luz, Genesis 28:12-22. As he slept in the open field, with his head pillowed on a stone, God was revealed to him in a dream. The wonderful vision of the stairway contains a direct reference to the promise to Abraham and the blessing of Isaac. The Lord told Abraham on 2 different occasions, "I will make your seed like the soil of the land. Count off the stars. Thus shall become your seed." Genesis 13:16, 15:5. And Isaac, conferring on Jacob the blessing of the firstborn, said, "So may the one Elohim give you of the dew of the heavens, of the fertile soils of the earth." Genesis 27:28. Solicitude to secure this blessing moved Jacob to deceive his father, and in consequence of that deception, he was compelled to flee to a strange country. And now that Jacob lay on the ground, a fugitive from home, the Lord, in the vision of the stairway, bridged the chasm of unfavorable surroundings which his cunning has interposed between the present and the attainment of the blessing which Yahweh had willed to give him. As the vision passed before the sleeper, the Lord stood beside him and said, "I am Yahweh Elohim of your father Abraham and the Elohim of Isaac. Do not fear. The land on which you are lying down, to you I shall give it, and to your seed. And your seed will become like the soil of the land. You will breach forth westward and eastward, northward and southward. All the families of the ground will be blessed in you and in your seed. And behold, I am with you. I will keep you in all the way you are going, and I will bring you back to this ground, for I shall not forsake you until I should have done all that I have spoken to you." Genesis 28:13-15. In this affirmation to give Jacob the land and the blessing of Abraham, the Lord pointed out the manner in which the fulfillment of his promise is to be brought about. He will be with Jacob and keep him and bring him again. He will not leave him until the promise is performed. When Jacob awoke out of his sleep, he made a vow, and therein manifested anxiety for bread to eat and a garment to put on. 28:20. Though his condition at the time exemplified the futility of his exertions and the fatal consequences of disbelieving God's word, yet Jacob again turned his shoulder upon the open gates of heaven to fall back upon his own resources. He took out of the Lord's hands a department of his life and undertook to manage it for himself, and in so doing laid the foundation for 20 long years of vexation. The stirring subject of God's disciplinary methods is not as clearly understood as it is clearly taught in the Word. Each insubordination of the believer's will sets in motion the forces which will eventually curb it. God has endowed each human action with the reproductive faculty, and the fruits resulting therefrom become the restraints which, like Balaam's ass, impede the advance of self-will and bring the erring one back to his senses. Jacob's anxiety for bread and raiment, combined with ready resources and executive ability, made it possible for such a man to become satisfied with success in an alien land. So God employed the meanness of Laban to check this inclination of the man and keep aflame the longing for the land of promise. Jacob relied on wit and natural ability to provide the accessories of life, and the Lord employed the wit of Laban to shatter his ground of self-reliance. The operation of this solemn principle is lucidly exhibited in King Solomon. He transgressed the law in 3 points, and the Lord raised unto him 3 enemies. The Mosaic law imposed upon the king 3 prohibitions. 1, to increase horses, 2, to increase wives, and 3, to increase silver and gold. Deuteronomy 17:16-17. Solomon flatly violated these injunctions. He acquired 12,000 horses for the royal stables, besides carrying on an extensive horse trade with the adjacent kings, for which purpose was organized a company of royal merchants. 1 Kings 4:26, 10:28-29. He took 1,000 wives, 1 Kings 11:3. He multiplied gold and silver to such an extent that the former became very common, while the latter was thought nothing of in his days. 1 Kings 10:21-27. The selection of Egypt as a center for horse traffic naturally would induce many Israelites to settle there for commercial purposes. To offset this allurement, the Lord made Jeroboam, Solomon's opponent, a favorite at Pharaoh's court. Solomon married an Egyptian wife. This alliance tended to promote cordial relations between the two countries and foster friendship with Israel's ancient foe. To counteract the influence of Egypt, the Lord endeared as a son to his father-in-law, Solomon's implacable enemy. To check the unlimited flow of silver and gold which poured into Jerusalem, the Lord raised against Solomon the king of Syria to harass the foreign traffic of Israel. Solomon made affinity with Egypt, and the Lord made Egypt the rallying center for his enemies. Oh, the depths of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. Second appearance, Jacob fared poorly in the house of his uncle. Laban, a rude, unprincipled man, recognizing no standard outside of personal advantage, sought to squeeze out of his nephew all he could, and treated him with little consideration. When Jacob complained of the treatment, Laban said, "Do specify your hire to me. I am determined to give it." Jacob answered, "You shall not give me anything," asking for his hire the speckled and flecked of the flock. Laban cheerfully endorsed the proposal, saying, "Let it be according to your word." Genesis 30:25-34. Having thus agreed upon a basis of compensation, Jacob forthwith conceived a scheme of deception to make sure of his wages. Genesis 30:37-43 records. Jacob's method of selective breeding of the flocks to ensure that the strongest and healthiest of the young would be speckled. Before this scheme was put into operation, the Lord sought to divert him from this deceptive course. The messenger of God said to him in a dream, "Lift up your eyes now and see that all the he-goats and the rams mounting up on the small cattle are striped, speckled, and dappled. For I have seen all that Laban has done to you. I am the one El who appeared to you at Bethel." Genesis 31:11-13. Jacob devised a plan to gain possession of the flocks. God made known to him his plan to give him the flocks. Again, Jacob is brought face to face with God's purpose, and again he adhered to his own way. This second attempt of Jacob to help God out ended as disastrously as the first. It invested God's interventive act with an air of rank fraud and provoked the ire of Laban and his sons. Though ignorant of the vision, these were well aware of his actions and resented them. They complained loudly, "Jacob has taken all that belonged to our father, and from what was our father's, he has established all this massive wealth." Genesis 31:1. Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and behold, it was not toward him as heretofore. Desiring to extricate himself from imposition, Jacob involved himself in further difficulties. Human actions are connected like the links of a chain. One false step leads to another. Accordingly, when God told Jacob, "Return to the land of your kindred, I shall be with you," Genesis 31:13, he was haunted by fears. The unfriendliness of Laban threatened further complications, and to avoid these, Jacob decided to leave his uncle by stealth. Laban pursued his nephew and overtook him at Mizpah, where there occurred a heated dispute between the two men. What a sad figure Jacob cut at Mizpah. His wives were the price of slavery, his children were Laban's by law, his flock was acquired by deception, and only God's intervention saved him out of the hand of Laban. Though God was with Jacob during his sojourn at Padan, Syria, he was not with Jacob in his acts. There was nothing in his deportment to mark him in the eyes of men as God's anointed, and Laban probably would have never learned that fact but for God's direct communication of the matter. Had Jacob obeyed the messenger of God, he would have gained the flocks and won the recognition of Yahweh's favor from his enemies. As it was, he acquired the flocks in sorrow, but missed the greatest of blessings, the prerogative of being his light-bearer to men. Restful faith, ideal faith, is restful. This does not mean that activity will not be involved in the believer's response to God's declarations, but that activity will reflect a confidence that what God has said will surely come about. In his early years, Jacob's activity was of a restless nature. His faith was not strong enough to wait upon God's timing or to accept God's ability to fulfill his promises apart from human assistance. Consequently, Jacob seized the birthright and the blessing, and he competed with Laban in a series of deceptive tactics for the enlargement of his estate, when all along God had chosen him for these blessings and many more, including that restful assurance of faith implied by Hebrews 11:21. By faith Jacob, when dying, blesses each of the sons of Joseph and worships, leaning on the top of his staff. We resume our meditation on Jacob's pathway after his flight from Laban, when once again God revealed himself to him in a vision. The third appearance, Jacob now, Genesis 32:1-2, finds himself in a great predicament, standing between the armies of two men wronged by him. The hosts of Laban have gone away, Genesis 31:55. The host of Esau are marching on, Genesis 32:6. The patriarch meets the messengers of God and calls the name of that place Mahanaim. God opened the eyes of his servant to behold the unseen hosts which encamped round about him, to protect him from Esau. Jacob had also learned from the lips of Laban how God, in a manner unknown to him, had restrained his uncle's wrath. The boundary between the visible and the invisible is drawn aside. The ethereal and the material embrace each other. The invisible world steps into the visible. The impalpable and intangible come within the reach of the senses. Faith for once has made itself visible to sight. Fear beholds the hosts of outraged Esau looming in the distance, and fills the heart with the gloom of despondency. Faith interposes between the trembling saint and the objects of his fears, a vision of what transpires in the court of heaven, allowing the host of Esau to be seen only through the screen of the celestial army. Before Esau can touch Jacob, he must destroy the hosts of God. God's purpose is seen and handled. At this time, messengers arrive with the report, "Esau is already coming to meet you, and 400 men with him." Jacob is alarmed at the news. The vision of the celestial army, though seen with the eyes of flesh, produced no soothing effect. The phantoms of past sins float continually before his eyes and take away rest. The imagination broods over the impending meeting with Esau and inspires feverish activity. Jacob is restless. He first divides his company, then resorts to prayer, but though pleading his having departed from Padan, Syria, pursuant to God's order, fails to gain the rest which consciousness of being in accord with God's way imparts. He appeals to God's promise of protection, yet fails to appropriate its peace-giving power. Genesis 32, 7 through 12. He leaves off praying to resume preparations. Just then, an idea flashed across his mind. I am determined to appease his face with an approach present. Genesis 32:20. He takes the sheep and asses and oxen, arranges them into 5 companies, putting space between drove and drove, and gives detailed instructions to the drivers. Jacob has been apprised of the wonderful way in which the Lord appeased Laban. He has seen the messengers come to his defense, but even truth clothed in tangible material form fails to act as a deterrent. He prefers his way. The 4th appearance, having arranged the present, Jacob lay down for the night with the servants, who had charge of the flock. He could not sleep, however, and kept revolving the situation in his mind. In the middle of the night, he arose and continued to prepare for any possible contingency. He moved his wives and children across the ford of Jabbok, and then lay down again. When Jacob was left alone, a mysterious one wrestled with him all night. Genesis 32:24. God now set himself to conquer Jacob's independence, and meeting with strong resistance, touched the hollow of his thigh and strained it. Let me go, said the wrestler. I shall not let you go unless you first bless me, replied Jacob. But could God bless acts and means inconsistent with his character and subversive of his purpose? The controversial point must be settled. What is your name? Said the wrestler then. Jacob, the supplanter, was the answer. God took Jacob by the hand, pressed it over the sore spot, and forced confession. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, said the wrestler, but rather Israel. For upright are you with Elohim and with men, and you are prevailing. Genesis 32:25-28. At Bethel, Padan, Syria, and Mahanaim, he had received revelations of God's plan and method, but supplanted them with his own contrivances. He strove to attain the blessing by self-exertion and endeavored to force God into his line of action. He had opposed the word and promise of God. At Mahanaim he met the messengers and went contrary to them. At Peniel he met God face to face, with the result that he was crippled for life. Yet this undoing was his making. God won him over to his line of action, and the new name expresses the result of that night's struggle. The self-willed supplanter, who insisted on having his way, becomes submissive to the divine rule. He who had striven against God is at last conquered and joyfully acknowledges himself vassal of the divine conqueror. I have seen Elohim face to face, and my soul was rescued. Genesis 32:30. The meeting with Esau, Genesis 33, 1-16, demonstrated the futility of the elaborate preparations at Jabbok. Esau, impulsive and good-natured, had long forgotten the past grievance and was glad to see his brother once more. While Jacob approached bowing himself 7 times, and the wives, each with her children, marched in procession, Esau, with that contempt for ceremony and display characteristic of a hunter, ran to kiss Jacob, and then glancing at the women asked, "Who are these with you?" Esau said also, "What is all this camp that I have encountered?" "To find favor in the eyes of my Lord," said Jacob. "I have much, my brother. Let what is yours be yours," retorted Esau. Jacob, however, insisted on Esau's receiving the present, saying to him, "I have seen your face as one sees the face of Elohim, since you are benevolent toward me." The deep anxiety of Jacob to secure the blessing gave rise to the various contrivances by means of which he attempted to ensure its attainment. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, and Jacob, instead of patiently awaiting its advent, which is a tree of life, endeavored to accelerate it by a manipulation of circumstances, and so did not fall in with ideal faith. Seeking to be exalted at one bound, he shut his eyes to the heavenly communications. He had striven with God to obtain the blessing ahead of time. He had striven with men who apparently stood in the way. At Jabbok, his self-will received a death blow, and Jacob received renewed assurance of blessing on recanting the methods hitherto employed to attain it. The period of fleshly activity is over, and a walk marked by princely dignity begins. The 5th appearance, after the meeting with Esau, Jacob journeyed toward Shechem, and there built an altar, and called on the Elohim of Israel, Genesis 33:20, in grateful acknowledgement of the sovereignty of him who conquered his self-will and delivered him from following its impulses. Having come back into the land, immediately he compromised with the environment as he found it. forsook tent life, building himself a house and booths for his cattle. He feared the inhabitants of the land and therefore sought to purchase peace at the expense of truth. A later order to the household, "Put away the foreign Elohim, clean yourselves and change your raiments," Genesis 35:2, intimates how far compromising went. This attempt to fraternize with idolaters ended in failure, resulting in the downfall of Dinah and the slaughter of the men of Shechem by Jacob's sons Simeon and Levi. Again God appeared to him, commanding him to go back to Bethel. "Arise, go up to Bethel, and dwell there, and make there an altar to El, who appeared to you when you ran from the face of your brother Esau." Genesis 35:1. This reference to past deliverance from foes is made to pretend deliverance from foes he may encounter in the future. In consequence of this word, Jacob ordered his household to purify themselves and put away the foreign gods. When this was done, the terror of God was upon the cities that were round about, and they did not pursue after the sons of Jacob. Thus the patriarch learned the dangers of latitudinarianism and the blessedness of effectual working of a living trust in God. The sixth appearance, on reaching Bethel, Jacob built an altar, Genesis 35:6-7. With what feelings must his heart have throbbed when he reached the place? With what regret must he have looked back upon the years in Paddan, Syria, marred by distrust in Yahweh, who had so wondrously revealed himself to him at a time of dire need? What consolation, what anchorage for faith he found in beholding God's promise of restoration realized. Here long ago he embarked upon a career of obstinacy. Here too he embarks upon a career of obedient childlike trust. As in the case of Abraham and Isaac, Jacob's venture upon the path of obedience is opposed by the enemy. Death enters his household, Genesis 35:8. Again God appears unto him for purposes of consolation, blessing him. "Your name is Jacob, yet your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but rather Israel, it shall be your name." Thus he called his name Israel. And Elohim said to him, "I am El who suffices. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and an assembly of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come forth from your loins. And the land that I gave to Abraham and to Isaac, I shall give it to you, and to your seed after you I shall give the land." Genesis 35:10-12. Here Jacob built a monument, offered a libation thereon, and poured oil thereon. Two great sorrows follow the second appearance of God at Bethel, the death of Rachel and the sin of Reuben, both of which evidence the lofty flight of the patriarch's faith. When the dying mother named Benjamin, "son of my sorrow," Jacob changed his name to "son of the right hand," Genesis 35:18, emphasizing the event, but diverting his mind from the contemplation of things as they existed round about him here on earth, and fixing it upon the celestial things. He discerns the working out of the divine plan amidst the mystery of the present condition of affairs. The temporary withdrawal of the sun's rays does not cloud his hope as he travels upon his diurnal journey. At this point, the life of Jacob becomes interlaced with that of his sons. Two stories run concurrently, that of Joseph and that of disruption within the house of Israel, and the removal to Egypt became necessary for their purification, Genesis 36-45. The seventh appearance, Israel now, Genesis 46:1, sets out with his whole encampment from Hebron for the land of Egypt. But it was not without misgivings that he was taking this important step. Must he go to Egypt? Was it not there that Abraham had come into collision with its king? Was not Isaac warned of God not to go thither? It seemed almost as if it would not be safe for him to venture within its borders. Preoccupied with such thoughts as these, Jacob found himself, in the course of his journey, at Beersheba. What memories clustered around that place? There Abraham met the supreme testing of his life. There God appeared to Isaac, and Abimelech came to acknowledge him as the blessed of Yahweh. Thence too it was that Jacob went out to begin his wanderings. Here, where naturally his thoughts were with his fathers, he sacrificed to the God of his fathers. Nor did he consult God in vain, for during the night God said to him, "Jacob, Jacob, I am the one, El, the Elohim of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I shall make you there into a great nation. I myself shall go down with you to Egypt, and I myself shall also bring you up, yea up, and Joseph shall set his hand on your eyes." Genesis 46:2-4. So Jacob went down to Egypt surrounded by the divine presence. The blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh shows how keen and marvelous and steadfast had become his spiritual perception. Even the strong pressure of tenderest ties could not swerve it from its course. His eagle eye pierces the gloom of centuries and lingers on the consummation. In the light of that glory, he reads and interprets the history of his sons. The whole life of Jacob has now been traversed, grace overcoming the will of the flesh, and faith overcoming the fear of man are the two outstanding lessons of this remarkable biography. There is, however, another lesson transcending these in solemnity, if not in importance. We learned at Peniel that intense longing to obtain the blessing prompted Jacob to recourse to cunning. Viewed through the lens of that night's struggle, the first period of Jacob's life exhibits the disastrous effects of seeking to obtain a good end by unholy means. This subtle temptation meets the believer at every turn. Too often have we yielded to this snare. Let us then learn and remember that, among men, goodness cannot use evil means without becoming evil itself. Thus, the use of evil means precludes the power of doing good. And, though Satan may bargain to give or accomplish this or that thing which is near our heart, we must not deal with him. For all our dealings are evil that are not dealings with good. And Satan does not hold to his bargain. For when once evil means are adopted, his end is gained, and we are captives, subject to his lordship and without appeal. Thus, unholy means lead certainly toward unholy ends. Joseph's pathway. Joseph belongs to the elite company of God's witnesses designated by the epithet chosen vessel. While the term may in a sense apply to all the servants of God whose ministry transcends the ordinary, yet its employment by the Lord himself, in the case of Paul, Acts 9:15, leaves no room for doubt of its being intended as an appellative of those who, by reason of the revelation received and the extraordinary mission entrusted, tower high above the rank and file of the redeemed phalanx. There are but three such chosen vessels whose splendor eclipses that of others: Joseph, Daniel, Paul. The career of Joseph in many of its features bears a striking resemblance to that of Daniel and Paul at a later day. The one stands at the commencement, the other in the middle, the third at the end of the Jewish history of revelation. All three lived in days of waning faith and deepening apostasy, and were driven from the land of promise by the intense antagonism of their faithless kinsmen. All three were chosen to bear God's name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. All three were the representatives of the true God and his people at heathen courts. All three were recipients of grand visions unfolding the divine counsel respecting the chosen nation, and were specially commissioned to the Gentiles. Finally, all three laid special emphasis on the resurrection. In turning to the career of Joseph, we shall first seek to embrace it all and view it as a whole. If we examine this portion of Genesis with care, we shall discover a perfection of workmanship and a beauty of design worthy of the divine author. The story of Joseph consists of two symmetrical halves, of 3 sections each, while every section of one half is balanced by a corresponding section in the other. Mission of Joseph, potential. 37. Joseph and his brethren, the counsel of God, resisted and rejected. 38th interlude. The history of Judah, 39-41. Joseph in Egypt, his abasement. Mission of Joseph, consummated. 42-45. Joseph and his brethren, the counsel of God accomplished and acknowledged. 46th interlude. The names of the sons of Israel, 47-50. Joseph in Egypt, his exaltation. Our attention is at once attracted to the remarkable series of visions which took the form of dreams. There are 3 pairs of such dreams, all prognostic. In his own words, they forecast what God is about to do. Genesis 41:25. The communications to Joseph were 2 in number, and under different symbolism reflect his own future. The bowing sheaves were a premonition of his being sent to preserve life. 45:5. The obeisance made to him by the sun and the moon and the 11 stars pointed to his being chosen to become one singled out from among his brethren. 49:26. The 2 pairs of dreams interpreted by him in Egypt foreshadow his mission to Pharaoh's empire and the world at large. What Joseph said to Pharaoh in interpreting his pair of double dreams may be said of this entire series. The dream is one. Two kindred lines of thought run through the dreams of the courtiers and their monarch: life and sustenance. The former is represented by the 3 branches of the vine and the 7 cows, the latter by the 3 trays of baked goods and the 7 ears of grain. Joseph, as is evident from subsequent history, was raised up to save Egypt, that it perish not through the famine, 41:36, and to save many people alive, 50:20. After Joseph had safely piloted the country through a crisis which might have resulted in general starvation and wildest anarchy, the Egyptians expressed their recognition of his mission of deliverance in the grateful verdict: "You have preserved our lives." Exodus 47:25. 2 distinct movements are perceptible in the career of Joseph. The first, chapters 37 to 41, unfolds God's mysterious dealings with him. The second, chapters 42 to 50, unfolds God's mysterious dealings toward him. Or to state it differently, the former period is devoted to the preparation of the vessel, the latter to his employment. The period of preparation is developed in 3 phases in which Joseph appears, respectively, as servant, prisoner, prince. The beautiful analysis of this interesting period is as follows: servant, 39:1. Joseph in Potiphar's house, 39:2 through 5. Yahweh with Joseph, 39:6. All committed to Joseph, 39:7 to 19. Joseph and Potiphar's wife, prisoner, 39:20. Joseph in prison, 39:21. Yahweh with Joseph, 39:22, 23. All committed to Joseph, 40. Joseph and Pharaoh's courtiers, prince, 41:1 to 14. Joseph before Pharaoh, 41:15 to 36. Yahweh with Joseph, 41:37 to 45. All committed to Joseph, 41:46.47. Joseph and Pharaoh. All through this section we are conscious of a duplex current. God works for Joseph. An unknown and unnamed power, operating through human instruments, works against him. The 2 movements run side by side, each leading up toward a definite climax. The hostile movement began with the animosity of his brethren and culminated in the attempt of the shameless wife of Potiphar to make him partner with herself in a revolting intrigue, which must have had strong elements of attraction to a young man of his age and in his circumstances. Genesis 39:7 through 10. The temptation at the hands of a strange woman was one of appalling enormity. It caught him by surprise when he was away from all external support and assailed 2 sides of his nature at one and the same time. It appealed to appetite and offered unstinted gratification thereof in a forbidden way. But this was not its subtlest aspect. The entering into a clandestine relation with his master's wife meant his own elevation in an easy and speedy fashion to Potiphar's exalted station. The immenseness of this allurement staggers one to contemplate. The dreams of youth were fresh in his mind. His imagination dwelt on God's revelation to himself made long ago through the bowing sheaves and the reverential stars, and he anxiously awaited its materialization. The hope of it upheld him all these years, and behold, here was a pleasant, easy shortcut to it. Joseph was thus simultaneously confronted with 2 of the very snares which 15 centuries later the tempter presented successively and in another garb to Joseph's Lord in the wilderness of Judea. He said to the Son of Man in his prostrate weakness and apparent desertion, "If you are God's Son, say that these stones may be becoming cakes of bread," proposing to allay hunger by a resort to illicit means. And again, after a dazzling and stupendous display of his imperial power, he promised, "All these to you will I be giving, if ever, falling down, you should be worshiping me," proffering the throne without the cross and obviating the Via Dolorosa that led up thereto. Joseph had the same experience. Satan's emissary, seeking to bewitch him with her charms, offered to carry him off to the palace of the pharaohs on the wings of sensuous delights. But Joseph, like the master, turned a deaf ear to the tempter whispering disloyalty to God. Not that he was insensible to the joys of life, but he had learned to make them subservient to the cause of truth and equity. His heart rested on the lofty post portrayed in the vision, but he was content to wait for its attainment in God's time and way. To the repeated solicitations of the fair temptress, He only reiterated the emphatic refusal. How should I do this great evil and sin against Elohim? Genesis 39:9. Victory over evil is not always followed by instant release from the straits instrumental in temptation, but it enables the victor to grasp the heart of heaven and draw it to himself. It imparts that certitude of triumph which lifts the heart to the calm of heaven, while the feet yet tread the morass of the world's ambitions. When the Master had repulsed Satan, he embarked upon a thorny path which took him several years to traverse. But the descent of ministering messengers was the token of his having grasped that power which was formerly vested in him in resurrection. Scorned by Joseph, Potiphar's wife gave vent to her rage, and in the circumstances of the occasion, found opportunity for revenge. But though his reputation was blighted, and his sufferings temporarily intensified, yet his faith was steadied, his hope clarified, and his love deepened. Unmindful of his own environments, Joseph made himself useful and agreeable. Noting the grief of the chief baker and the chief cupbearer, he inquired, "For what reasons are your faces troubled today?" And upon their rejoinder, "We dreamed a dream, yet there is no one to interpret it," Joseph, with amazing keenness of penetration, at once discerns the opportunity and answers, "Do not interpretations belong to Elohim? Relate it to me, please." And in offering to become the interpreter of their dreams, he takes another step toward the fulfillment of his own. Genesis 41-8. No one can read the story of Joseph without being impressed with his marvelous capacity for adaptation. Unbounded faith in the truth of God's revelation enabled him to reconcile the well-nigh maddening discrepancy between the benevolent plans of the Almighty and the violent means instrumental in their furtherance, and to grasp the threads of method. He accepted whatever came with resignation and devotion and made the best of it. Suffering cast him upon God, and in fellowship with him he acquired that calm, resolute equipoise of spirit which made him master of the situation wherever he went. A palm tree, so I have been told, grows stronger the heavier the weight that is put upon it. Joseph clave to God, and adversity only disciplined him into greatness, and imprisonment only taught him to make the best of his liberty. The public manifestation of greatness always follows the ascendancy of the will over temptation, where right and wrong were guilefully concealed in the manner of their presentation to choice. Israel recognized Solomon's greatness the day he issued the famous verdict in the case of the two women. But in reality, his greatness dated from that night at Gibeon, when God said to him in the vision, "Ask what I shall give to you." And he replied, "Will you give to your servant a hearkening heart to judge your people?" 1 Kings 3:5-9. In like manner, Pharaoh's confession of Joseph's greatness before the court was but a public recognition of that greatness which he had displayed in refusing to acquiesce to the wishes of Potiphar's wife. It is easy to see, if we care to read between the lines, that speaking after the manner of men, his adaptability was a potent factor in his success. He did not struggle against a higher might. He bowed down to the inevitable and adjusted himself to it. He had learned that acquiescence in affliction is the first step in the way out of it, and was thus ready to enter the doors which God flung open at the critical turnings of his history. If he had violently withstood his brothers, they would have killed him, but his docile deportment won him the sympathies of Reuben, who dissuaded the others from their murderous intent. If again he had not cheerfully and wholeheartedly served the interests of Potiphar, the latter would have executed him on the strength of his wife's accusation. Yet again, if he had been brooding over his miseries in the dungeon, he would have missed the opportunity of interpreting the dream to the chief cupbearer, an event which paved the way for his ultimate elevation to the second place in the kingdom. Joseph's employment, the bitter reverses in Joseph's life did immeasurably more than steady and ripen his confidence in the divine purpose. They enabled him to trace the process of its evolution in the affairs of men. Thus, when ushered before Pharaoh, not only could he interpret his dream and impress the certainty of its fulfillment upon the listeners, Joseph could also apply it to the tasks of life, and was able to point out the pursuance of the course that would save the country from ruin. Genesis 41:14-36. He evinced spiritual insight that could read the mind of God and translate it in terms of common experience. He evinced likewise spiritual energy that could render it operative. Convinced that none was better qualified than Joseph to direct the affairs of state, Pharaoh then and there raised him to the second place in the kingdom, and invested him with the insignia appropriate to the office to which he had appointed him. Here, much to our regret, we must leave untouched his public administration and pass on to the consideration of the dealings of God through him, as seen in his ways with his brethren. God told Abraham, "You shall know, yea, know, that your seed shall become a sojourner in a land which is not theirs." 15:13. As the time for this migration drew nigh, he sent a man before them. Psalms 1:05-17. The sons of Jacob, through Joseph's dreams, were apprised of this, but were not prepared to fall in line with God's plan. The Lord sent them good tidings by a prophet like unto them, but they rejected the message and set themselves to thwart the purpose which Yahweh was carrying out for their good. They said, "Behold, this dreamy person there is coming. Come now, let us kill him and fling him into one of the cisterns, and we will say, 'A wild animal, it has devoured him.' Then we shall see what will come of his dreams." Genesis 37:19-20. They were to be preserved from starvation, but above all, they had to be brought back to God and fitted for participation in his course of action. Here was the supreme task confided to Joseph, a task which he accomplished with rare skill, admirable wisdom, and extreme tenderness. Let me just rapidly point out Joseph's method of bringing his erring brethren back to their senses. They had sold Joseph into slavery on the pretext that he had come as a spy to report their evil deeds. Now, as they stood before him, he prefers against them the same charge: "You are spies," Enoch 42:9. Seeking to refute the accusation by a statement of the family status, the flagrant transgression is brought back to their memory. "Your servants were 12 brothers, sons of one man in the land of Canaan, and behold, the youngest is with our father this day, and the one, he is no more." 42:13. One is no more. Joseph perceived that in spite of what had come and gone, he still had a place in their hearts, so he leads them a step forward. They had cast him into a pit, and now he cast them under guard for 3 days and awaited the result. They are thus made to face the liability of isolation and loss of liberty to which they had consigned him. Within the prison walls, they brood over the ill treatment of their tender, defenseless brother, saying one to another, "As for his blood, indeed it is required from us," and recognize in the strange proceedings of the Grand Vizier the hand of providence. "What is this that Elohim has done to us?" 42:17-28. When the sons of Jacob went down to Egypt the second time, taking Benjamin along, Joseph continued the testing ordeal, all unknown to them. They are ushered to the dining hall. Joseph occupied one table, the Egyptians another, and the 11 brethren a third. To their astonishment, the seats at the table are assigned to them according to seniority, but Benjamin receives preference in the serving of portions. They had envied Joseph in former days because the father had shown him preference, and now he wants to ascertain whether they harbor the same feelings toward the one who has succeeded him in the father's affection. They displayed no ill feeling, however, and the feast was one of unmarred gladness. 43:15-34. One point was lacking. Were they willing to suffer for the father's favorite? To prove them on this point, Joseph's cup was concealed in Benjamin's bag. When they are intercepted by the overseer and the brothers, conscious of innocence, submit themselves to search, the overseer, acting under instructions from Joseph, raises the question, "Why have you repaid evil for good?" 44:1-5. That was the malicious spirit which moved them when they taunted him with their mocking words of long ago. "Let us kill him, and we shall see what will come of his dreams." And they did see, but the sight was different from that which they had planned to make. How unconscious, too, these men were that in prostrating themselves to the ground before the Lord of Egypt, they were doing anything to verify their brother's dreams. It is impossible to describe the thrill that tingled through his frame as now at length, in this marvelous manner, he saw the fulfillment of his early dreams. How near he must have felt God to be in that supreme moment. The brothers, of course, had no deliberate intention of opposing God, but they allowed themselves to drift. They were without spiritual force and without serious thought. They followed limply their own uncontrolled desires, just as children would. And with all that, though children, they were capable of noble deeds. There is indeed a strange mixture of good and evil, of fine and despicable qualities in Joseph's brothers. The furnace of affliction consumed the dross, and brought in evidence the finer qualities. The pleading of Judah is extremely touching. O my Lord, let your servant speak now a word in my Lord's ears, and let your anger not grow hot against your servant, for you are like Pharaoh. My Lord, he asked his servant, saying, Have you a father or a brother? And we said to my Lord, We have an old father and a child of his old age, the youngest. Since his brother is dead, he alone is left of his mother, and so his father loves him. Then you told your servants, Bring him down to me. I am determined to set my eyes on him. And we said to my Lord, The youth cannot leave his father. When he would leave his father, then he would die. But you told your servants, If your youngest brother does not come down with you, you shall not see my face again. And it came to pass as we went up to your servant our father that we told him the words of my Lord. Later our father said, Return, purchase for us a little food. Yet we said, We cannot go down. If our youngest brother is with us, we will go down. For we cannot see the man's face if he, our youngest brother, is not with us. Then your servant our father said to us, You yourselves know that my wife bore 2 sons for me. One went forth away from me, and I said, Surely he was torn to pieces, yea, torn to pieces. And I have not seen him hitherto. If you take this one also from my presence, and mishap would befall him on the way, then you would bring down my gray hairs with evil to the unseen. So now, if I should come to your servant our father, and the youth were not with us, since his soul is tied up with his boy's soul, then it will come to pass, as soon as he sees the youth is not with us, that he will die. And your servants will bring down the gray hairs of your servant our father with affliction to the unseen. For your servant became surety for the youth to my father, saying, If I do not bring him back to you, I will be at fault before my father all my days. So now let your servant stay instead of the youth as a slave to my Lord, and let the youth go up with his brothers. For how could I go up to my father if the youth were not with me? For fear that I may see the evil which would come upon my father. 44:18-34. How different this speech of Judah from the one he made to his brethren years before. His simple eloquence proved the genuineness of their repentance and their willingness to make reparation. The supreme moment had arrived. Joseph ordered the outsiders out of the room and made himself known to them, saying, I am Joseph. Then he kissed them and wept with them. Genesis 45:3-15. How simple, searching, and solemn is all this. One who with moist eyes and music in his heart had innocently suffered as a transgressor was able to pilot these guilty men, without bitterness and revenge, to a haven of rest. He could deal with them on the basis of truth, yet showing mercy at every turn. He gently leads them to face their sin, makes them realize its awful guilt, curbs the independent spirit which inspired the sin, renders them willing to bear the punishment they laid on him. And when the gentle stroke of mercy had wrung confession, then comes the touching declaration, Do not be grieved nor angry with yourselves, that you sold me hither, because Elohim has sent me on before you to preserve lives. 45:5. What a marvelous illustration of God's way with the sinner. Joseph's pathway, the interests of brevity, will not allow us to enlarge. But it seems fitting, before drawing this series to a close, to point out the secret both of Joseph's greatness and goodness. Let it first be noted that the conflicts which he had to wage, unlike those of his predecessors, were all external. There was little in him of that antagonism between flesh and spirit, that alliteration between good and evil, strength and weakness, which preponderates in Jacob. From the very first, Joseph heartily embraced the truth, and his struggles were not so much with himself in order to maintain undivided allegiance, as they were with others who impeded its advance. He suffered at the hands both of his brothers and the Egyptians. The former persecuted him for his loyalty to the revelation of God, the latter for his firm adherence to purity and rectitude. Then in the second place, let us consider a point which throws valuable light on the whole remarkable career of this wonderful man. While his brothers were out tending the flocks, Joseph remained at home with Isaac and Jacob. The meditative grandsire would tell him how from the summit of Mount Moriah, through the arrested sacrifice of his son, Abraham saw down the ages into the mystery of Golgotha, and Jacob would recite the wonderful interpositions of God at Bethel, Mahanaim, and Peniel. This fellowship developed in the boy a receptive frame of mind and powerfully impressed upon him God's intervention for his chosen ones in extremity. Thus he early acquired that unbounded faith in the truth of God's revelation, which is the salient characteristic in Joseph's character. When God, by means of dreams, acquainted him with the career mapped out for him, Joseph immediately fixed his gaze upon it. The intervening chasm of present conditions did not disturb him. He knew God would fulfill his word, and so regarded circumstances, though apparently irreconcilable with the end in view, as the vehicles of its fulfillment. Unbounded confidence in God's communication resulted in 1. Moral courage. He did not fear to tell his brother's misdeeds, though they threatened to kill him. He refused point blank to gratify the passion of his mistress, though she could dispose of his life. He did not shirk telling the chief baker the fate awaiting him, though the task was a disagreeable one. 2. Absolute trust. Believing God's word, he discerned God's hand in adversity, and though his heart was wrung with anguish, he was able to say, "You devised evil against me, yet Elohim devised it for good." Genesis 50:20. 3. Self-possession. He believed that all things work together for good unto them that love God. He realized the Lord had designed the imprisonment. This kept him from overestimating its hardships. The Lord lifted him to the throne, and this kept him from overestimating its honor. The fetters did not sour his heart, and the royal robe did not turn his head. The sense of God's presence kept him from despondency and affliction, and from pride and prosperity. 4. Condescension. It is recorded that when Pharaoh sent for Joseph, he shaved himself and changed his garments. 41:14. He was willing in external matters to conform to the usages of the society in which he moved, and did not cause friction by laying undue stress on traditional customs. 5. Magnanimity of spirit. The foregoing spirit of Joseph, surpassed only by that of Christ, was the result of his faith in the universality of God's providence. His experience demonstrated that through all the evil that men intended to do to him, God wrought out a more exceeding weight of glory. This expanded his capacity for sympathy and compassion. I conclude with drawing attention to the fact that the superiority of Joseph to his predecessors lies in the fact of his dignified suffering for righteousness. His predecessors were victors of faith. They were noted for their mighty triumphs. They appeal to the heroic in us. They command all active virtues. Their lives are illustrations showing that nothing is impossible with God. Joseph was not only a victor, but a victim of faith. And it takes a deeper phase of faith to suffer for God than to accomplish for God. To be and to suffer are greater than to do. Dying Jacob heaps the choicest blessings upon the head of him whose bow abode in perennial steadiness, when the archers bitterly enraged against him and contended with him. Genesis 49:23-24. His winsome career concluded as it began, with an expression of unbounded faith in the word of God, looking forward to the resurrection. I am about to die, yet Elohim shall take note, yea, take note of you. He will bring you up from this country to the land about which Elohim swore to our fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then Joseph adjured the sons of Israel, saying, When Elohim shall take note, yea, take note of you, then you will bring up my bones with you. Genesis 50:24-25. Author, Vladimir Gelesnov. Published by Concordant Publishing Concern, all rights reserved, concordant.org.